Howdy, all you delicious people. I'm here today to review the movie The Princess Bride. So, justifiably, when going into this movie, the real reason why I'm reviewing this film and taking the time today to review it is basically because I think a lot of times when I go into this movie, I'm reminded about all the stuff that I usually would quote out during any video or something like that, like "love her as I loved her" and all this kind of weird quotes that I would probably say in some video that probably no longer exists, probably in this on this channel or on any other channel. To Glaive ultimately is something that I would normally shout out a lot of times through videos just because it'd just be a weird thing to shout out at some point in time. When going into this movie, I think immediately I'm brought back to a very simple time where ultimately we'd have it to where there is some kid who ultimately needs to be read his story for some reason, and we have an older generation of person that is ultimately going to sit back and ultimately read a book to someone. I think there was a lot of times where you would take that journey through a lot of movies and stuff like that. That's hence why they had the movie Neverending Story, and they had a lot of other kind of things that were along those lines of approaching, where you'd have it to where some old geezer, or uh, some mom, or some dad, or whatever would come in and read somebody a story, and that'd be the way that a movie usually ends, or usually opens. I mean. Um, Going into here, I thought that point in time where ultimately I saw that was just kind of really like bringing me back into a time period where ultimately they used to do that a lot, and I used to enjoy that kind of thing. And it was always fun to me to just kind of watch that kind of approach. Hence why in Deadpool 2, the Christmas special, or the cut for kid special, we ultimately go into this whole segment, and we have it to where Deadpool is ultimately uh, reading a story to Ben Savage's character, which ultimately uh, they kind of redo this whole scene, and so on and so forth. So funny that Fred Savage and ultimately Peter Walk are just basically called the grandson and the grandfather in this movie, unless they actually had an actual name. Because ultimately in here, we have it to where Robin Wright's character is just called the Princess Bride, when actually I think her name was Buttercup through most of this movie. So going into here, I thought that this movie was like, I think it still holds up. I don't think this movie is one of those where ultimately you just kind of pull it apart and just say like, "Nah," like it's a movie that I think still stands the test of time. I think a lot of stuff is still maybe not laugh out loud, ha 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 ha, funny, but I think it still has a very much like there is some kind of things that you can just kind of like have a little smirk about and like like I like those parts. I like at points in time you can kind of smirk through a movie and just be like like yeah, there's some hilariousness where ultimately we have it to where Wesley's character is just kind of consistently like doing so well against characters like in Inigo Montoya, uh, or ultimately uh, Vinny or Vizini, yeah, I guess. Vesic, man, yeah, any of the names of which we actually have in this movie, good God, they have to be the most complicated or very absurd to try to pronounce. And so that's what makes it so interesting to be able to go through, especially this movie, where it's like you either have names that are easy to pronounce or names that aren't. So going into the names, Carl or Carrie Ilwis, or Ellis. Ultimately, I know him from, of course, this movie, but also like Saw, the very first Saw, and then ultimately him being in. I think I saw him in the Sugar Mountain with Jason Momoa. I thought that movie's pretty good. Um, reasonably we have it to where there's any number of characters in here, like Prince Humperdinck, Fright Night, um, Andre the Giant. I know him from wrestling. Fred Savage went on to do like Austin Powers, and ultimately, really, that's about as far as it really goes. Within Fred Savage, I know that he was on, I think, a show called like Life Support or something like that, or Child Support or something like that. Robin Wright currently in the Wonder Woman movies. Why I don't know, but ultimately she was also in the Moneyball movie, which I kind of liked that film. But anyways, so I think it's easy to know that this movie has stood the test of time. There's really good things about it. There's funny things. Love her as I love her, and ultimately any number of things. So let's go out of our way to ultimately go and just spoiler time about this movie, talk about it, get it out of the way, and then say that we can just call it a day for this video. Because ultimately we have another video to do. So let's go into spoiler time. Spoiler time, it's about that time I'm going to spoil this movie. So ultimately, we have Ben Savage's character, or Fred Savage. Ben Savage is the other guy. Fred Savage ultimately is a sick kid who ultimately needs to hear a story from his grandpapa, and so ultimately we have it to where Peter Falk's character goes in and starts off this story because we have it to where Peter ends up giving Fred a present, which ultimately is the Princess Bride book. So ultimately, we find out that this is like a generational book that seems to be a passed down thing from person to person to person to person, and so now Fred's character is ultimately going to be that passing down book holder, and so on and so forth. So we end up having it to where reasonably in the very beginning of this we have it to where seemingly that Peter's character is ultimately mentioning about the romance of it all, and Fred's character immediately is complaining about like, nah, I don't want all this kissy stuff. Like, if anything, I love sports and I like fighting and whatever. And ultimately, Peter's character is mentioning it's like, well, we'll get to that. Like, if anything, like there's going to be fencing, there's going to be fighting, but there's also these parts as well. So we end up finding out that seemingly that Buttercup, who is Robin Wright's character, who is the Princess Bride, ends up latching herself onto some uh, seemingly some horse made guy or some kind of just butler of her, where reasonably we have it to where she's consistently ordering him to do all this stuff. And every single time we have it to where Wesley ultimately says in response, as you wish. To where it's just kind of hilarious that that kind of becomes that guy's catchphrase and that guy's like thing in this movie, to where every single time she ultimately would go on and realize that it's Wesley by Wesley saying as you wish. So we end up having it to where Wesley consistently ends up doing things for her, and we have it to where Buttercup is ultimately to be head over heels for Wesley, and we have it to where Wesley goes off supposedly and goes onto a boat to ultimately supposed to be murdered by some pirate. Where ultimately Buttercup is ultimately lost and all depressed and all disheveled. So here's the thing that I would have loved to gotten the backstory and or visuals of. Man, I wish that ultimately the whole Wesley story would have been actually played out. Like what had happened to him, how he died, and instead, like basically we got a whole entire like visual or just verbal thing of what all had happened to Wesley. I wish that ultimately like we would have had like a story inside of a story, and I think that would have been really method or whatever. So we end up having it to where Wesley is supposedly dead. And so we end up having it to where Buttercup ends up being thrusted in the arms of another man to ultimately be led to be some princess of sorts, and so on and so forth. So, we end up having it to where reasonably this princess ends up getting to have been stolen by Inigo Mentorio. If I'm even pronouncing that right, I'm probably butchering the name, even though you repetitiously have to hear that name as well through this movie. Inigo Mentorio. Anyways, we have it to where Montario and Physique end up, or Fezzik ends up stealing Buttercup, and we have it to where they uh, end up on this ship, where we have it to where Zizzini is ultimately mentioning about how inconceivable everything is. So we ultimately have it to where seemingly Vizzini, with his inconceivable notions about things, ultimately we have to where seemingly he is going and putting a piece of garment of a enemy of Humperdinck's to send a message to say, hey, yeah, like send these people off to war because the Princess Bride's horse ultimately has a garment of their enemies. And so that's kind of smart in a way. But, anyways, so we have it where Fazzini and Fessex and Montario are all on this boat with Buttercup. And so we have it to where it seemingly Montario is consistently looking back to where Vizzini is like, well, why are you looking back so much? And we have it to where Montario is like, are you sure that we're not followed? Like, are you sure that we're not being tailed? And Fazzini is like, no, that's inconceivable. There's no way that anybody would know. And so we end up having Montario consistently looking back, consistently, to where Fazzini is like, God, I'm so irritated by him looking back all the time. Why is he looking back? Because ultimately we have it to where ultimately uh, Vizzini is ultimately going off onto the boat, and bizarrely we have it to where like Vizzini at first was ridiculing and making fun of both his shipmates, ultimately talking about how Montorio ultimately like was so broke at one point he couldn't buy brandy, and we have it to where Vizzini was talking to Fessex, ultimately mentioning how hopeless and or helpless and hopeless and all kinds of whatever things was Fessex. So we end up having bizarrely where Montario and Fessex are both rhyming, telling that telling all these rhymes to ultimately get under Vizzini's skin, ultimately mentioning about how like we better have charm. Stop doing that rhyming, I mean it. Anybody want a peanut? Silly motions, silly rhymes and stuff. I love rhyming. I think it's funny to interject in a movie, just to get under someone's skin. Um, that's why I would have loved if DC Comics would have ever done the Etrigan the Demon character as a movie, because I think that would have been hilarious to watch a guy that has to forcibly rhyme all the time and everybody has to call him out on it, and I think that would be hilarious. So we have it to where ultimately we have it back again where ultimately supposedly someone is following this ship, and so ultimately they end up going like, well, hey, like, why is this guy is so quick to like come after us? Like, man, is he like, how is he gaining speed so much? So we end up having it to where ultimately Fezzik and everyone else ultimately go off to shore to ultimately go on to climbing a rope up seemingly this little rock here, and we have it to where eventually we have it to where the Dread Pirate Roberts is ultimately to follow these men. So we end up having it to where ultimately this Dread Pirate Robert is to climb up with this rope onto this rock, and so ultimately they end up cutting the rope, and they think that ultimately this guy would be plunging to his death. Well, instead he's ending up hanging on to the rocks. So we end up having it to where ultimately Vizzini is ultimately telling basically for Fezzik and in Montaria to hold this masked Zorro-ish looking man off. Even though he's not Zorro, he's actually Dread Pirate Roberts. So we end up having it to where ultimately, so we have it to where Dread Pirate Roberts is ultimately just hanging on to the rock. He's basically not moving 1 inch. We ultimately have it to where Inigo Mentorio ultimately is just kind of like, man, like I'm waiting for a long time for this guy, so ultimately I can fight him in a sword fight. So we end up having it to where Montorio ultimately goes and talks to the masked man and ultimately says, "Hey, are you going to be able to get to me anytime soon?" And we have it uh, to where the masked man is ultimately saying like, "Well, yeah, you'll just have to wait." Like it it doesn't look all that easy, and so we end up having it to where Montario is promising that ultimately he'll help him get to the top alive, and ultimately putting his word that as a Spaniard, and ultimately the masked man is ultimately like, no, I've met too many Spaniards. Ultimately, we have it to where uh, Montario is promising, and so ultimately the masked man is like, okay, throw the rope down. So we throw the rope down, and ultimately the masked man ends up getting up. So we end up now having a sword fight of sorts. So we ultimately are to find out that Montario ultimately is going to fight a sword with his left hand because ultimately, if he did it with his right, the fight would end too quickly. And so we have it to where ultimately Montario is ultimately fighting with his left hand, and also so is the masked man. So we end up having this sword fight consistently, and before this, we have it to where Montario ends up letting the masked man just kind of like rest and get his footing, and ultimately we find out that there's rocks in this guy's boots. So we end up having them find out that both of them aren't actually left-handed sword fighters; they're actually right-handed sword fighters. And we have it to where both of them end up kind of going and doing this like gymnastic uh, uh, like movement to ultimately get down to their swords and stuff along those lines. So eventually we have it to where the masked man had bested Montorio, but we have it to where the masked man has so much respect for Montorio that ultimately he won't kill him, he will just knock him out. So ultimately we move on to ultimately have it to where the masked man is going to have to fight out with Fezzik. So we end up having it to where Fezzik's character, who is played by Andre the Giant, anyways. So we have it to where Fezzik's ultimately is to ultimately hold on to a rock, and I'm like, man, like you can kind of just see that this rock is just kind of like Andre's hands is so big that even this rock is like nothing to him. So we end up having it to where ultimately the masked man is to ultimately go and try and simply find a way to outmuscle Fezzik, which is really a hard thing to try to do. But anyways, we have it to where seemingly we have it to where we have bizarrely where the masked man is ultimately going to try to do some kind of bear hug to ultimately take down Fezzik, which isn't going to work. So we ultimately seemingly have it to where the masked man ends up getting onto Andre's back and ultimately tries to do some kind of chokehold or rear naked chokehold to try to get Andre to pass out. And eventually we have it to where that quite possibly does work. So, moving on, we have it to where the masked man is to ultimately go on to Vizzini. So we have it to where ultimately we have this goblet debacle. We ultimately have it to where we have a match of utter brain beside brawn. And so ultimately we have it to where the masked man is putting a game together for Vizzini to ultimately have it to where there is one poison in one of the goblets. I don't know why there's all of a sudden wine there. I don't know why all of a sudden there's goblets there. I don't understand why they ultimately have to do this brain thinking match. Ultimately, we have it to where reasonably the masked man could ultimately punch Vizzini in the face and knock him out. But I guess we're not doing that here. So we end up having it uh, to where reasonably that the masked man is ultimately saying like, okay, well, which cup is it? Which cup is ultimately going to be the one filled with poison? And so we have it where Vizzini is consistently like going back and forth, ultimately mentioning like, well, I can't get the one, I can't drink the one that's close to me because ultimately I'm assuming that I have poison in my drink. But um, but then I would assess that ultimately, if I took the one in front of you, you're the one that ultimately has the poison in your drink to ultimately make me. And so we have it to where Vizzini is going back and forth, ultimately mentioning all of this stuff. Basically, that the masked man wouldn't put the poison in his drink because ultimately the masked man would remind himself that he's mortal and he can't drink the poison because ultimately he would die. So we have to where this is going round and round and round, and we have to where the masked man is ultimately telling Vizzini, it's like, well, you think I'm going to slip and tell you some secret, but it's never going to happen. So we end up having it to where Vizzini is kind of rattling his brain, like thinking that he can't drink the one in front of him, or he can't drink his drink, and so on and so forth, and back and forth. But eventually, we have to where Vizzini ends up going, "Hey, look over there!" And then we have it to the masked man looks over there, and we have it to where Vizzini switches the drinks, ultimately going and having what is to be the masked man's drink. So they have it to where ultimately Vizzini ends up drinking the drink, and so does the masked man. And ultimately, Vizzini ends up getting poisoned and ends up getting clunked and dies. We ultimately end up having it to where Buttercup mentions to the masked man that ultimately, like, oh, your drink had the poison the entire time. And ultimately, we have it to where the masked man had said, no, both drinks were poisoned. I just got an immunity to this poison, and ultimately, what does that do for me? So we end up having it to where Buttercup and the Masked Man are going on their way to ultimately. We really have it to where the Masked Man is to eventually uh, kind of understand what has happened to Buttercup all the time, the whole entire time that she has gotten to this point, and we happen to find out technically who is the Masked Man and his backstory. So we ultimately have it to where Buttercup is ultimately angry and upset about this masked man who had ultimately killed her Wesley. And we ultimately end up having it to where Wesley or the masked man is ultimately like talking about like, well, like, what about you? It's like, if anything, like, I'm sure Wesley's death meant nothing to you, and so on and so forth. And ultimately, Buttercup is like, well, I died that day. that I heard the news of Wesley dying and so on and so forth. And so ultimately, while this is going on, we eventually have it to where we have it to where blah 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 blah. Prince Humperdinck is on his horse, ultimately, seemingly far well behind, seemingly trying to find Buttercup, and ultimately finding that ultimately all these battles that had happened, supposedly the Dread Pirate Roberts ultimately going into a sword fight with uh, Montorio, and ultimately someone had taken down a giant of sorts. And so ultimately, we eventually get it to where ultimately we are to have seemingly Buttercup seemingly knock the masked man over, which ultimately has him go over a hill to ultimately remove his masked face. All while that is going on, we have him say, "As you wish," and then ultimately we have Buttercup finding out that Wesley was uh, was this masked man the entire time. So ultimately, she goes onto a tumble with this hill as well. To where ultimately we find out that ultimately the prince and his cohorts have been riding all the way through to ultimately realize that, well, um, these two characters have ultimately they're going to try to make their way uh, to where they need to go. They're going to have to go forcibly through the swamp. So we end up having it uh, to where Buttercup and Wesley are to ultimately share a kiss, knowing full well that Buttercup is realizing that this is Wesley that she tousled down this hill, and also to the fact that ultimately she loves him more than anyone else. So we end up having it to where Wesley is ultimately ultimately taking uh, Buttercup into this swamp that ultimately is plagued by fire at some points. And so we end up having it to where Buttercup's dress goes on fire and so on and so forth. So eventually we have a tour here where ultimately we are to have Wesley talk about his journey and how reasonably, in an almost like DC Phantom like way, if you guys remember the Phantom movie with Billy Zane, where basically we had it to where ultimately Wesley was an inheritant of a pirate title. Really, how the Dread Pirate Roberts had been a thing that seemed to be a thing that had passed down from person to person to person, because when really looking at it, like nobody wanted to actually uh, have someone else's other name and whatever. So ultimately, they went by the most famous name, which was the Dread Pirate Roberts. So ultimately, we have it to where seemingly Wesley had took the name Dread Pirate Roberts to ultimately keep the name alive, and ultimately because we had it to where Wesley ends up going and working with the Dread Pirate Roberts, and ultimately we find out that there was a whole back history about all this and so on and so forth. So ultimately, Wesley ended up inheriting the name instead of actually being killed by that man, and so ultimately we have it to where we find out that ultimately Wesley and Buttercup are talking about the things that they ultimately do not believe in, and so ultimately we have it to where Wesley is to ultimately not believe in rodents of very large size, where we end up having it to where Wesley is attacked by a giant rat. So we end up having Wesley having to wrestle down this giant rat, and ultimately we have it to where Wesley ends up wrestling this giant rat into ultimately a fire thing that ultimately burns this rat alive, to where justifiably Wesley kills it. So we ultimately end up to where reasonably that Wesley and Buttercup are to make their way through this swamp. But it is kind of ultimately inevitable that it seems that the enemy will ultimately make their way to getting to Wesley and Buttercup, which ultimately is Prince Humperdinck and the Count Rugen. Rugen. So we end up before having Montorio mentioning that he is on a quest to find a six-fingered man, and ultimately we had it to where Montorio doesn't know who exactly that is, and so we ultimately have it to where Montorio had asked Wesley if ultimately he was that man, and ultimately, sadly, he was not. So we end up having it to ultimately after this whole swamp debacle that eventually Buttercup and Wesley end up being greeted by Count Rugen, and ultimately we have it to where uh, Buttercup is to be sent back into the what is the word castle to be wedded. There we go. Castle to be wedded by Prince Humperdinck, and ultimately we are led to have Wesley to be tortured to death. So, or to believe to be mostly, or to be tortured mostly to death. So we go on to ultimately have it to where Wesley is to be tortured in some torturing place, where ultimately we have Count Rugen ultimately doing experiments, ultimately having it to where seemingly he is putting a machine together that is seemingly suction cupping somebody's life away. We ultimately have it to where there's some bizarre concoction where you have to toss coggles and so on and so forth to ultimately have these suction cups sucking the life out of supposedly Wesley. We ultimately have it to where supposedly he adjusts it to have seemingly one life or 1 year of life be taken from Wesley. So we end up having it to where Wesley is getting the sucked of life out of him, and ultimately we have it to where the Count is ultimately asking like, well, tell me the truth, tell me how you really feel, and we ultimately have it to where Wesley's like, and we ultimately have it to where the Count is going like, interesting, and so we end up having it to where ultimately, and Wesley end up telling the Count once he has met him that ultimately he realizes that ultimately he had six fingers on his right hand, and ultimately like someone was looking for him. So we have it to where ultimately Wesley's being tortured. Well, boo-hoo for him. And so we end up having it to where reasonably we have it to where Buttercup is supposedly going to get married. It seems like she's going and seeing and noticing that ultimately there is, while she's going to get married, that it seems like she's having this horrible dream about some old woman going, boo! Boo on you! You had true love all along! Boo! Why are you going to end up with Prince Humperdinck? You had true love all along! Boo! So we have it to where seemingly Buttercup is otherwise just very upset about all this, and ultimately knowing and realizing that she had her true love all along. So we end up having it to where ultimately seemingly Montaria is getting a word that ultimately the six-fingered man is ultimately out there, and it is this court guy. And so ultimately we have it to where, because Montario is just a drunken schlob and whatever, and ultimately we have it to where Fezzik is ultimately trying to clean Montario up, because again, word about the six-fingered man and so on and so forth. And so we have it to where ultimately Montario is saying like, well, the only person that could help us um, through getting into the castle is the man in black, and so we ultimately have to find him. So we ultimately have it to where Prince Humperdinck is all up into the sad place, because really he's realizing that Buttercup uh, will never love him, or will never love him until Wesley is dead. So we end up having it to where Prince Humperdinck ends up going to the torture chamber place and ultimately pushing up the levels of blood or whatever suction cuppingness to ultimately get it to where it's 50, and we have it to where the count says, no, not 50. So we end up having it to where Wesley is screaming in utter anguish to where ultimately everybody in the world can ultimately hear what Wesley is yelling about. And so I think it would have been hilarious if somebody would have been trying to be sleeping at that time. Like, shut the F up, Wesley. I'm trying to sleep. So we end up having it to where the now sobering up Montorio and Fezzik are otherwise hearing the utter screams of the man called Wesley, and they're like, yes, he must be in anguish because ultimately Prince Buttercup and or Princess Buttercup and Prince Humperdinck are going to be wedded soon. And so we end up having Fezzik and Montaria end up going all the way out to this forest to find this albino character. And so ultimately they find out that ultimately they could ask this albino character to ultimately tell them exactly where they are torturing Wesley right now, to not know whether or not that he is alive and or dead. So we end up having Andre's character ending up bumping this guy in the head, but I guess the albino got too bit of a bump on the head to where it knocks him out. To ultimately, we have it to where Montario ultimately has his spirit of his father guide his sword. And so we have it to where Montario ultimately goes into guide with his sword to find out where the heck Wesley is. And so ultimately we have it to where Wesley ends up going and hitting this tree with his arm to ultimately unlock this seemingly door. And so we end up having them going down to this secret place to ultimately collect Wesley, and they find out that, well, he's dead. So we end up having them trying to figure out some wizard magician like guy that could otherwise go and bring Wesley back to life because again they need him. So we end up having seemingly Montaria and Fezzik send Wesley to a miracle man. So, or Miracle Max, I mean. So we end up having it to where they knock on the door. Ultimately, we have Miracle Max mentioning that they'll send the Brute Squad out for them, and we ultimately have Andre saying, well, I'm the Brute Squad. And so ultimately we have it to where Miracle Max lets them in. Ultimately, we have it to where Montorio tells Miracle Max about a story about ultimately that his wife is crippled, and which is all a lie about basically what this guy desperately needs to be alive for. And so ultimately we have it to where Miracle Max is like, yeah, you're full of crap. Like, I bet he owes you money. And so we end up having it to where ultimately Miracle Max ultimately goes and puts like an air blower or whatever, one of those kind of like blower things, and kind of like puts it into Wesley's mouth and just starts to like pull back and forth to ultimately get air into Wesley, because ultimately he realizes that he's mostly dead, he's not all dead. So we end up having Miracle Max end up pushing onto the chest of Wesley to confirm that the real reason why Wesley isn't 100% dead yet is because of true love. And so ultimately we have it to where Miracle Max is like, I don't think he's really said true love. I think he said to glaive, which ultimately means to bluff. So ultimately the only reason why he's still alive is to gamble. And ultimately Montorio is saying like, no, like the real reason what he's going to try to do is ruin Prince Humperdinck's wedding and so on and so forth. Miracle Max is like, ruin the wedding of the guy that I don't like that ended up firing me. That sounds great. So we end up having it to where Miracle Max and his girl Valerie ends up going and putting this chocolate candy and ultimately giving it to uh, Fezzik and Montorio to ultimately give to Wesley. So we end up having it to where Fezzik and Montorio drag Wesley's body to this castle, and ultimately they give him the chocolat. So they give him the chocolat, and so ultimately he wakens shortly thereafter. And then shortly after that, he starts like wiggling his thumb or just starts like moving his head. And so ultimately, they have it to where there's like some fun moments where ultimately Fezzik and Montorio are forcibly moving Wesley's body to where ultimately he can see and stuff like that. And so, anyways, so we end up having it to where they end up mentioning how they're going to get past these 60 men with basically just uh, basically Fezzik, who is strong, and Wesley, who is smart, and Montaria, who's cunning or whatever. Anyways, so we go on to have it be that ultimately they are going to scare these 60 men by bringing up the spirit uh, of seemingly the Dread Pirate Roberts. So who is Wesley? So they end up going on and ultimately going and putting together some giant cloak that ultimately Andre the Giant is now wearing. And then ultimately we have it to where Montoya and Wesley are kind of behind Andre the Giant, dragging this thing to get closer and closer to the castle. Where ultimately we have it to where Andre the Giant is mentioning, "I will kill you," and it's on and so forth, and all kinds of things, because this sucks because there's so many men here and so on and so forth. So, anyways, we have it to where Andre is more and more pushing forward and so on and so forth, and we have it to where everybody's running away because this Andre the Giant, has a cloak on, is now on fire, and ultimately, like everything is all crazy and everybody's running around. So we eventually have it to where ultimately Andre ultimately takes the cloak off, which is so on and so forth. So we have to where what is it called? The castle trudge thing, the thing that ultimately is blocking anybody from getting to the door of the castle is falling down. We have it to where Andre ends up grabbing it and pushing it back up. So we end up having it to where now is the time for ultimately Andre to take down seemingly this man that ultimately is the one person that is kind of standing in front of this castle. So we end up having it to where reasonably. So we have this wedding going on. Where ultimately we have this priest that is ultimately giving this wedding, and so ultimately we're not going to have any interruptions of this wedding, so on and so forth. And so we end up having this priest who's ultimately mentioning about true love. What a beautiful sight this is, true love. And so ultimately we have it to where the prince is desperately asking for them to rush the proceedings of the wedding. And so ultimately we have this priest who's like, well, you have the wings? And so ultimately we have it to where we end up pushing on through this ceremony and ultimately finishing it all up. To where ultimately Buttercup is mentioning to the king, which ultimately she is having to go back to her room. She is mentioning that once she gets to her room, she's going to end herself because reasonably she can't go on without being the wife of Wesley's. So we end up having it to where ultimately Wesley is to ultimately be right at right at Buttercup's room, but we'll get to that. So we end up having it to where the true little busy bee of a thing is to ultimately get it to where Montario gets to get his man, because that's the most important thing. So we ultimately have it to where supposedly Fezzik and Montaria are chasing after this count. We ultimately have it to where Fezzik ends up dropping Wesley to be held by some statue, and then when Fezzik goes back to see uh, Wesley is gone for some bizarre reason. Hence why he appears in Buttercup's room. So we end up having it to where ultimately uh, Montaria is ultimately asking Fezzik to open this door for him, and so we end up having it to where Montaria and this Count character end up fighting it out. It seems that ultimately the Count ends up tossing a blade to ultimately hit Montario's chest, and we ultimately assume that he's going to die. But ultimately, Montario's spirit just won't let him die until ultimately he gets the vengeance that he needs onto his father. So we end up having it to ultimately Montario is mentioning uh, to the Count that he's like, my name is Inigo Montario. You killed my father. Prepare to die. And so ultimately he's repetitiously saying that as he's fighting. And we have it to where the Count ultimately at some point says, stop saying that. My name is Inigo Montario. You killed my father. Prepare to die. And so ultimately, repetitiously, we keep having to say this guy's name and so on and so forth. And we ultimately have it to where, like, consistently, Montario had been stabbed numerous times in the chest, in the shoulder, or in the arm. And so ultimately, we have it to where we have the Count who is suffering or going to have to suffer the same wounds, ultimately scraping his face like he did to Montario, stabbing him exactly where ultimately Montario had been stabbed, and so on and so forth, making it to where this Count ends up bleeding out. So we end up having it to where now Wesley is in Buttercup's room. So we are to now have it to where ultimately, seemingly, the prince makes his way also to Buttercup's room. And so ultimately, we end up having it to where we have it to where Buttercup is kissing Wesley, and then the prince arrives. So we end up having it to where Buttercup is asking for Wesley to hug her and comfort her and whatever, and we have it to where Wesley is ultimately just like, gently. And she's like, why are you telling me gently? And he's like, gently, because ultimately he can't move most of his body still. So we end up having it to where ultimately uh, Wesley is mentioning to Buttercup that technically she hasn't been married to the prince yet because ultimately she hasn't said "I do," which is kind of a formulaic or kind of a stupid thing to ultimately bring up. That's like, well, like because she didn't say "I do" and so on and so forth. That ultimately not everything is 100% married up or whatever. So ultimately, there's some wiggle room to this whole marriage thing or whatever. But anyways, so we end up having it to where reasonably the prince ends up coming in, and ultimately I'm assuming, or I should assume that ultimately they're going to have a fight out. But reasonably they aren't. So I just thought that that was kind of like, they don't actually fight it out? What kind of garbage is this? Like, I thought there was going to be a fight out, but evidently not. So we end up having it to where Wesley ends up going into and mentioning that in all actuality between him and the prince, like, he's actually fine. He ultimately gets up and sits from off of his bed to ultimately hold a sword to the prince, and ultimately mention that I will hurt you, I will attack you, I will beat you, I will blah blah blah. ultimately mentioning how, like, Wesley mentions how he will disfigure the prince to ultimately make it look like he will look awful to everyone else. He will take out his eyes and take off his nose and take off his any other things, and we have it to where ultimately the prince is like, "Yeah, take my ears," and ultimately we have it to where Wesley's like, "No, I'm going to leave them perfectly fine." So every time somebody screams in utter horror, every time they see you, you will hear that reaction every single time. So we end up having it to where Wesley ends up going and tying seemingly the prince to a chair, and then we realize that Wesley isn't actually as healthy as he says he is, and ultimately we have it to where the prince ultimately saying, "Aha! I knew you were bluffing." So we ultimately have it to where Wesley is to open the window, to ultimately have it uh, to where Andre outside of the window has ultimately prepped 4 horses. So we end up having Montario ending up meeting Wesley at the place where he is at, and we end up having it to where ultimately Buttercup and Buttercup ends up flying out the window to be caught by Andre, and so eventually everyone is to follow afterwards, be caught by Andre, and ultimately to get onto their horses and ride off. To eventually ultimately have it to where Wesley and Buttercup end up kissing, and we end up having it to where ultimately the grandfather is to ultimately close the book before they actually kiss, and we have it where the grandson is completely happy about the kiss because ultimately it's just a happy ending. So we ultimately have it where the grandson is mentioning to the grandfather, it's like, hey, like, will you come and read me this story again sometime soon? And the grandfather is ultimately mentioning that he'd love to do that. So he ultimately ends up walking away, and that's how the story ends up ending. So that's all that I wanted to say about Princess Bride. Some very fun moments. To Glaive and love her as I love her is probably love her as I loved her. Is always kind of a funny quote. Recently after that, like a lot of them, like there's some kind of interesting lines that everybody pulls away from, like inconceivable or any other uh, kind of like the rhyme kind of things going on with there, and so on and so forth. I always find this movie to just be fun. It's so fun to watch, and it doesn't matter like kind of how old it is. It's still always a real fun movie to watch. So I'm gonna get out of here. Goodbye, everybody. Goodbye, everybody.